So, I tend to agree that the fight or flight response isn't useful in many contemporary situations. It can be thought of as maladaptive, a hindrance, essentially. There's a school of thought that says panic disorder is a persistent malfunctioning of our instinctual fight or flight response. This line of thought falls under the header of evolutionary psychology, but I think we should always be very careful about making any definitive claims with respect to human nature. Such claims are, more often than not, a reflection of one's ideology, as opposed to anything based in the real world. Proponents of capitalism often claim that it is simply human nature to act in our own quote-unquote self-interest. Conversely, anarcho-primitivists claim that human nature is really more in line with the hunter-gatherer societies of, say, the Paleolithic age. In both cases, you could see how they have very conveniently front-loaded the conclusions of their arguments within the very premises due to particular ideological predispositions. Both are engaged in circular reasoning. One of the major things that distinguishes us from other animals is that we have the ability to work together in order to change the conditions of our reproduction. And since that is apparently within our nature, it makes sense to say that human nature is not fixed, but rather contingent upon our social relations, the way we relate with one another. Another commenter says, "The doomer brings irony to the end of humanity. What existential terror has always lacked from those decimated by capitalism to those terrorized by the possibility of nuclear annihilation to those huddling as bombs dropped, and especially today as we await the increasing destruction of the climate, much like an upcoming victim of Jason Voorhees waits for his turn to be slashed, is any sense of irony. Existential terror has been nothing but entirely sincere, nothing but entirely traumatic." Okay, but it's important to keep in mind the dangers of irony as a reflexive response to the seemingly insurmountable challenges we face today. I'd like to call to mind something the late David Foster Wallace said on the topic. Irony and cynicism were just what the U.S. hypocrisy of the 50s and 60s called for. That's what made the early postmodernists great artists. The great thing about irony is that it splits things apart, gets above them, so we can see the flaws and hypocrisies and duplicates. The virtuous always triumph. Ward Cleaver is the prototypical 50s father? Sure. Sarcasm, parody, absurdism, and irony are great ways to strip off stuff's mask and show the unpleasant reality behind it. The problem is that once the rules of art are debunked, and once the unpleasant realities, the irony diagnoses are revealed and diagnosed, then what do we do? Irony is useful for debunking illusions, but most of the illusion debunking in the US has now been done and redone. Once everybody knows that equality of opportunity is bunk, and Mike Brady's bunk, and Just Say No is bunk, now what do we do? All we seem to want to do is keep ridiculing stuff. Postmodern irony and cynicisms become an end in itself, a measure of hip sophistication and literary savvy. Few artists dare to try and talk about ways of working towards redeeming what's wrong, because they'll look sentimental and naive to all the weary ironists. Irony's gone from liberating to enslaving. There's some great essay somewhere that has a line about irony being the song of the prisoner who's come to love his cage. In response to my last video, this commenter says, "It's not a bad assessment, but just as you said the generational aspect of it is too reductive, the same could be said about the ideological one. The majority of issues, attitudes, and even aesthetics can be seen in the late Soviet Union and post-Soviet countries. Pretty much all of our 1980s to 2000s rock music, film, and other aspects of culture are informed by this disillusionment in the system that was promising a whole lot, but not able to deliver much. While the sense of having no future, no place of belonging, no safety net, or even healthy relationships is currently tied to the failure of capitalism, it is hardly unique to it." I'll respond to this by posing a question. What do you suppose the Soviet Union in its later years has in common with the United States in 2020? For more context, watch Adam Curtis's Hypernormalization. The full documentary is available on YouTube. I'll have a link in the video description. This commenter says, "Doesn't help that almost everyone in America is always thinking about going somewhere else. We can't be content. Call me a political enemy, but if everyone appreciated, interacted,